When my wife's father died, my lazy wife inherited his house and $33 million. Then she kicked me out saying, "Find somewhere else to live or die, I don't care. You're useless now." Days later, the lawyer laughed. "Did you even read the will?" My wife went pale because the will said, "You know what they say about death bringing out the worst in people?" Well, they weren't kidding. When my father-in-law Richard Hayes kicked the bucket last month, I figured it would be one of those somber family moments where everyone comes together, shares memories, and maybe learns to appreciate what they've got. Boy, was I living in fantasy land. Richard had been sick for months, pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't mess around. I'd spent countless evenings at his bedside, listening to his stories about building his business empire from scratch, watching old war movies with him when Clarissa was too busy to visit. The man had grit, I'll give him that. Came from nothing and built a fortune that would make most lottery winners weep with envy. $33 million, to be exact, plus that ridiculous mansion in the hills that looked like something out of a Hollywood movie. I thought maybe, just maybe, watching her father waste away would teach my wife Clarissa something about loss. See, I'd been through this dance before when both my parents died in a car crash 5 years ago. That grief nearly destroyed me. The kind of soul-crushing pain that makes you question everything you thought you knew about life. Clarissa had been, well, let's just say supportive isn't the word I'd use. More like mildly inconvenienced by my emotional breakdown. But Richard's death? That was supposed to be different. That was supposed to be her wake-up call about mortality and family and all that heavy stuff that makes people reevaluate their priorities. Instead, it was like Christmas morning for a spoiled brat who just discovered Santa left the entire toy store under the tree. The reading of the will was a joke. Clarissa sat there in her designer black dress, probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, with this smug little smile playing at the corners of her mouth. When the lawyer announced she'd inherited everything, the mansion, the money, the whole damn empire, she didn't even try to hide her satisfaction. Just nodded like she'd been expecting it all along. Which, knowing Clarissa, she probably had been. That's when things got really ugly. Within a week, my sweet, loving wife transformed into someone I barely recognized. Gone was the woman I'd married 7 years ago, the one who used to laugh at my stupid jokes and steal French fries off my plate. In her place was this cold, calculating stranger who looked at me like I was something unpleasant she'd stepped in. The mansion became her kingdom, and I was suddenly the court jester who'd outlived his usefulness. She started making suggestions about how I should find my own path now that she was financially independent. Because apparently, inheriting millions gives you the right to treat your spouse like expired milk. Then came that evening 3 weeks ago. I'll never forget it as long as I live. I was in what used to be our bedroom, folding laundry like some kind of domestic servant, when Clarissa walked in wearing this ice-cold expression that could have frozen hell over. "We need to talk," she said. And brother, those 4 words have never meant anything good in the history of marriage. I looked up from the pile of shirts, trying to read her face. "What's on your mind, babe?" That's when she dropped the nuclear bomb that obliterated what was left of our marriage. "Find somewhere else to live, or die? I don't care. You're useless now." Just like that. No build-up, no explanation. No, it's not you. It's me bullshit. Just pure, unadulterated venom delivered with the emotional warmth of a parking meter. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, holding one of her silk blouses in my hands, trying to process what I'd just heard. "Excuse me. You heard me, Darien. You're dead weight. I don't need you anymore. I have everything I want now, and you're just in the way." The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. This was the woman I'd sacrificed everything for. The woman I'd worked 60-hour weeks to support while she found herself through yoga retreats and expensive hobbies. The woman I'd given up my own dreams for, turning down job opportunities and shelving my ambitions because her needs always came first. "Clarissa, what the hell has gotten into you? We're married. We took vows." "Oh, please." She waved her hand dismissively, like she was shooing away an annoying fly. "Those vows were made when I needed you." Things change. I've changed. My circumstances have changed. You haven't. Behind her, I caught a glimpse of her brother-in-law Marcus lurking in the doorway with this satisfied smirk on his face. He'd been hanging around more and more since Richard's death, whispering poison in Clarissa's ear about how she deserved better, how she was meant for bigger things. The guy had always resented that I'd married into the family, like I was some kind of gold digger who'd tricked his way into their precious bloodline. So that's it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. 7 years of marriage, and you're throwing me away like garbage? Don't be so dramatic. I'm giving you an out. A fresh start. Consider it a favor. A favor. She thought destroying my life was a favor. That night, while Clarissa was out celebrating her new independence with Marcus and their country club friends, I packed my entire life into 2 beat-up suitcases and a cardboard box full of photos and mementos. 7 years of shared memories, reduced to 3 containers that barely filled the trunk of my old Honda Civic. I took one last look around the mansion that had never really felt like home anyway. The marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the pristine white furniture that screamed, "Don't touch anything." It was all hers now. The woman who'd once promised to love me in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, had just proven those words meant absolutely nothing when push came to shove. As I loaded my pathetic belongings into the car, I couldn't help but think about all the compromises I'd made, all the pieces of myself I'd given up to make her happy. The promotion I'd turned down because it would have meant relocating. The friends I'd lost touch with because Clarissa didn't approve of them. The hobbies I'd abandoned because they weren't sophisticated enough for her social circle. And for what? To be discarded the moment I was no longer useful? The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was the casual cruelty of it all. She didn't even have the decency to pretend it was difficult for her. No tears, no apologies, no acknowledgement of what we'd shared. Just cold, calculated dismissal, like I was an employee being laid off from a job I'd never applied for. As I drove away from that mansion for what I thought would be the last time, I caught a glimpse of Clarissa in the rearview mirror, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching me leave like she was making sure the garbage truck had properly collected the trash. That image burned itself into my memory. My wife of 7 years, the woman I'd loved more than life itself, making absolutely certain that the man she'd deemed useless was finally out of her perfect new life. I had no idea that in just a few short weeks, that same image would come back to haunt her in ways she never could have imagined. Let me tell you about rock bottom. It smells like industrial-strength disinfectant mixed with the broken dreams of every poor bastard who's ever checked into the Sunset Motor Lodge. And brother, I was now the latest addition to that illustrious club of life's spectacular failures. The place looked exactly like what you'd expect from a joint that charged $39 a night and had a flickering neon sign that only managed to spell out "Sue ETMOL" on a good day. The parking lot was a graveyard of beat-up cars and questionable life choices, and mine fit right in with the rest of the automotive disasters. The desk clerk, a guy who looked like he'd seen more action than a war correspondent and cared about as much, barely looked up when I stumbled through the door with my 2 suitcases and box of memories. He just slid a key across the counter and grunted something that might have been room 12 or move your car. Honestly, the guy's communication skills weren't exactly Harvard level. Room 12 turned out to be a masterpiece of budget hospitality. The carpet was this charming shade of "what the hell happened here," and the wallpaper was peeling like a bad sunburn. The bed looked like it had been through more relationships than a Hollywood starlet, and the bathroom, well, let's just say I've seen crime scenes that were more inviting. But here's the kicker. This dump was paradise compared to the emotional wasteland I was living in. I collapsed onto that saga mattress that probably predated the Clinton administration and just lay there, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked suspiciously like either Jesus or maybe a really sad duck. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional sounds of domestic bliss from the adjoining rooms. You know, the kind of bliss that involves a lot of shouting and what sounded like someone getting acquainted with the furniture. That's when Clarissa's parting gift really started to eat at me. Before I'd packed my life into storage containers, she'd tossed me a handful of cash like I was some street performer who'd just butchered a Beatles song. "Here," she'd said, not even looking at me. "This should last you a few weeks until you figure out your next move. $300. 7 years of marriage, and I was worth $300 lousy dollars to her. I'd seen people tip more than that at fancy restaurants. But as I lay there listening to my upstairs neighbor apparently trying out for the Olympic furniture throwing team, something started gnawing at me. It wasn't just the humiliation or the betrayal, though those were doing a fine job of eating me alive from the inside. No, it was something else. Something that didn't add up. See, Richard Hayes wasn't the kind of guy who left things to chance. The man had been a perfectionist in everything. His business, his investments, hell, even the way he organized his sock drawer was like something out of a military handbook. He'd planned every detail of his empire with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker, and he'd built it from the ground up through sheer determination and an almost obsessive attention to detail. So why the hell would a guy like that just dump his entire fortune on Clarissa and walk away? I'd spent enough time with Richard over the years to know how he really felt about his daughter. Don't get me wrong. He loved her, but he wasn't blind to her faults. The man had built a business empire through hard work and sacrifice, and Clarissa's biggest accomplishment was mastering the art of spending other people's money with Olympic-level skill. Richard used to joke about it, actually. That girl could burn through a fortune faster than Sherman went through Georgia. He'd say with this mix of affection and exasperation that only a parent could manage. He knew she was entitled, knew she was lazy, knew she had about as much business sense as a goldfish. So would a guy like that really just hand over everything to someone he knew would probably blow it all on designer handbags and European vacations? The more I thought about it, the more it bugged me. Richard had always been kind to me. Hell, more than kind. He'd treated me better than his own daughter had in the last few years. We'd bonded over old movies and war stories, and he'd actually listened when I talked about my dreams and ambitions, which was more than I could say for my own wife. There was this one conversation we'd had about 6 months before he got sick. We were sitting in his study, sharing a bottle of whiskey that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and he'd looked at me with these serious eyes and said, "Darian, you're a good man. Better than this family deserves, if I'm being honest." At the time, I just figured it was the whiskey talking. But now, lying in this fleabag motel with nothing but time and regret for company, those words kept echoing in my head. The ceiling fan wheezed and clicked like it was on life support, and I found myself replaying every interaction I'd had with Richard in those final months. The way he'd looked at Clarissa sometimes, like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. The comments he'd made about making sure the right people were taken care of. The way he'd always insisted on talking to me privately about important matters. Had I missed something? Had there been signs I was too caught up in my own misery to notice? By 3 in the morning, I'd managed to convince myself I was losing it. Grief and desperation were making me see conspiracies where there were none. Clarissa had inherited everything fair and square, and I was just the discarded husband looking for some kind of cosmic justice that didn't exist in the real world. But when dawn finally crawled through those moth-eaten curtains, bringing with it the cheerful sounds of traffic and human misery, I made a decision. Call it curiosity, call it desperation, call it the last pathetic gasps of a man who'd lost everything. I was going to find out the truth. With the few dollars I had left after paying for another night in paradise, I dug out my phone and looked up the number for Charles Whitmore, Richard's longtime attorney. The man had been handling the Hayes family legal affairs for over 20 years, and if anyone knew the real story behind Richard's will, it would be him. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number. This was probably going to be the most embarrassing phone call of my life. The pathetic ex-son-in-law fishing for scraps, hoping against hope that maybe there was some kind of mistake, some tiny loophole that might throw me a lifeline. But something deep in my gut told me this wasn't over. Richard Hayes had been too smart, too careful, too damn strategic to leave his life's work in the hands of someone he knew would destroy it. And if I was right, if there was more to this story than Clarissa's triumphant inheritance, then maybe, just maybe, the man she'd called useless was about to prove just how wrong she'd been. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. When Charles Whitmore's receptionist finally answered, I took a deep breath and stepped into what I hoped wasn't just another dead end, but the beginning of something that might just change everything. Charles Whitmore's office was the kind of place that screamed old money from every mahogany-paneled surface. Walking through those doors felt like stepping into a different century, where handshake deals actually meant something and lawyers wore 3-piece suits because it was Tuesday, not because they were trying to impress anyone. The receptionist, a silver-haired woman who looked like she'd been guarding the gates of legal wisdom since the Eisenhower administration, informed me that Mr. Whitmore could see me immediately. That should have been my first clue that something was up. In my experience, lawyers don't just drop everything for broke guys who smell like cheap motel soap and desperation. But Charles? He greeted me like I was the prodigal son returning home for Christmas dinner. Darian, my boy. He practically jumped up from behind his massive desk, which was covered in more legal documents than a Supreme Court case. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. Your wife told me you'd left town. I stopped dead in my tracks. She told you what? Said you'd packed up and moved to, where was it? Arizona? Nevada? Somewhere out west, anyway. Said you wanted a fresh start after Richard's passing and didn't want to be contacted about any legal matters. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. That lying, scheming, backstabbing which had been intercepting my mail, screening my calls, basically erasing me from existence while she played queen of the castle. I should have been furious, but honestly, I was almost impressed by the sheer audacity of it all. Charles, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I've been staying at the Sunset Motor Lodge about 15 minutes from here. I never left town, and I sure as hell never told anyone I didn't want to be contacted. The old lawyer's eyebrows shot up so high they practically disappeared into his hairline. He walked over to a filing cabinet that looked like it could survive a nuclear blast and pulled out a thick manila folder with Richard's name on it. Son, we need to talk. And I mean right now. He gestured to the leather chair across from his desk, the kind of chair that probably cost more than my car and felt like sitting on a cloud made of butter and good intentions. Charles settled behind his desk with the folder in front of him, looking at me like he was about to deliver news that would either make my day or ruin my life. Darian, what exactly did Clarissa tell you about her father's will? That she inherited everything. The mansion, the money, the whole $33 million empire. Pretty cut and dried, according to her. Charles made a noise that sounded like a cross between a chuckle and a snort. Cut and dried. That's rich. He opened the folder and pulled out what looked like the original will, thick, official-looking papers with more seals and signatures than a peace treaty. Let me ask you something, son. Did you actually see this alleged will? Were you present at the reading? I thought back to that day. Clarissa had come home from the lawyer's office practically glowing with satisfaction, waving some papers around like she'd just won the lottery. But now that I really thought about it, no, I admitted. She said it was family business. That since I wasn't a blood relative, I didn't need to be there. She brought home copies of some documents, but I never saw the actual will. Copies. Charles shook his head like I'd just told him I'd bought the Brooklyn Bridge from a guy in a trench coat. Of course she did. He turned the will around so I could see it, and my heart started pounding like I'd just run a marathon. Even upside down, I could see my name mentioned multiple times throughout the document. Darian, according to Richard's actual last will and testament, the one he signed, witnessed, and notarized in this very office, you are the primary beneficiary of his estate. The words hit me like a freight train carrying a cargo of disbelief. I'm sorry, what? The mansion, 70% of his liquid assets, controlling interest in his business holdings. It's all yours, son. Every last penny of it. I stared at the document like it was written in ancient Sumerian. But Clarissa said. Clarissa was left $10 million, Charles continued, flipping through the pages. A very generous inheritance, mind you. But it came with conditions. What kind of conditions? Charles adjusted his reading glasses and found the relevant section. The bequest to Clarissa Hayes Morrison is contingent upon her treatment of her husband, Darian Morrison, following Richard's death. Should she fail to honor the bonds of marriage and treat her husband with the respect and dignity he deserves, said bequest shall be null and void, and those assets shall revert to the primary beneficiary. My mouth went dry. You're telling me that by throwing me out like yesterday's garbage, she forfeited her entire inheritance? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Charles leaned back in his chair with something that might have been satisfaction dancing in his eyes. Richard was very specific about this clause. He'd watched his daughter's behavior over the years, seen how she treated you, and he wanted to ensure that his money didn't enable her to become an even worse person than she already was. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. This is insane. Why didn't she know about this? Oh, but she did. Charles pulled out another document. A receipt showing that Clarissa had been provided with a complete copy of the will 3 days after the funeral. She received the full, unredacted will. She chose to ignore the conditions, probably thinking they were just her father's way of being dramatic from beyond the grave. So she gambled with $10 million and lost. Spectacularly. Charles couldn't hide his grin anymore. Richard always said his daughter was too arrogant for her own good. Turns out he was right. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. The woman who had called me useless, who had thrown me out like I was nothing more than unwanted furniture, had just handed me a fortune through her own cruelty and stupidity. "There's more," Charles said, and I wasn't sure my heart could take any more revelations. "Richard left you a personal message. He recorded it about a week before he died. He pulled out an old-fashioned tape recorder, the kind they probably used during the Nixon administration, and pressed play. Richard's voice filled the room, weak from illness but unmistakably determined. "Darian, if you're hearing this, it means my daughter has shown her true colors. I'm sorry, son. I tried to raise her better, but some people are just born selfish. You've been more of a family to me these past few years than she ever was. Take care of what I've built. Use it wisely. And don't let her guilt you into giving her a damn penny. She made her choice." The recording ended, and I sat there feeling like I'd just been hit by emotional lightning. In the span of 20 minutes, I'd gone from being a discarded husband living in a Fleabag motel to the heir of a multi-million-dollar empire. Charles was watching me carefully, probably wondering if I was going to pass out or start laughing maniacally. Honestly, I was considering both options. "So what happens now?" I finally managed to ask. "Now," Charles smiled like a shark who'd just spotted a school of particularly tasty fish. "Now we make this official. We freeze Clarissa's access to any funds she's already touched, transfer everything into your name, and watch as the woman who called you useless realizes just how spectacularly she's screwed herself." For the first time in weeks, I smiled. A real, genuine smile that came from somewhere deep inside my chest. "Charles," I said, "let's get started. You know that feeling when you're about to drop the hammer on someone who absolutely deserves it? That sweet, almost intoxicating moment when karma finally decides to clock in for work after taking the world's longest coffee break? Yeah, that's exactly where I was sitting in Charles Whitmore's office, signing documents that were about to turn my cheating, lying, gold-digging wife's world upside down. "I need you to understand," Charles said, his pen hovering over what looked like enough legal paperwork to choke a horse. "Once we set this in motion, there's no going back. Clarissa will lose access to everything. The accounts, the credit cards, the house, all of it. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" I thought about those 3 weeks in the Sunset Motor Lodge, listening to the sounds of other people's broken dreams through paper-thin walls. I thought about Clarissa's ice-cold eyes when she told me to find somewhere else to live or die. I thought about the casual cruelty with which she'd discarded 7 years of marriage like it was a subscription she didn't want anymore. "Charles," I said, putting pen to paper, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The first domino fell within an hour. Charles had this network of contacts that would make the CIA jealous, and he put every one of them to work. Bank accounts were frozen faster than a Minnesota lake in January. Credit cards were canceled with the efficiency of a Swiss train schedule. The utilities at the mansion, electricity, gas, water, internet, even the fancy security system, were all transferred back into my name by close of business. But the real kicker was Rosa Delgado. Rosa was a private investigator who looked like she could bench press a Buick and had a reputation for finding dirt on people that would make a tabloid journalist weep with envy. Charles had worked with her on dozens of cases over the years, and when he called her about investigating the forged documents Clarissa had been waving around, she was practically salivating over the phone. "Honey," she told me during our brief introduction, "I've seen some grade-A scumbags in my time. But a woman who forges her dead daddies will to screw over her husband? That's a special kind of evil. This is going to be fun." By 5 o'clock that afternoon, Rosa had already uncovered enough evidence to sink Clarissa's little fraud scheme deeper than the Titanic. Turns out my dear wife had paid some 2-bit document forger named Jimmy the font Castellano to create a fake while using letterhead stolen from Charles's office. The guy apparently specialized in fake IDs for college kids, but Clarissa had convinced him to branch out into high-end document fraud for the low price of $50,000. The beautiful irony? She'd paid him with money from Richard's accounts, money that, according to the real will, she never had legal access to in the first place. It was like watching someone rob a bank with a gun they'd stolen from the same bank. While Rosa was busy building a case that would make the DA's office Christmas dreams come true, I decided to take a little drive. After 3 weeks of feeling like the world's biggest loser, I figured it was time to remind myself what winning felt like. I pulled up to the mansion just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn that probably cost more to maintain than most people's annual salaries. The house looked different somehow, smaller, less intimidating. Maybe that's what happens when you realize you actually own something instead of just visiting it. The front door was locked, but Charles had given me the new keys along with a smug little smile that suggested he'd been planning this moment for weeks. I let myself in like I owned the place, which, according to a stack of legal documents, I actually did. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the marble foyer, and I couldn't help but grin. 3 weeks ago, I'd been sneaking around this place like a guest who'd overstayed his welcome. Now I was home. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of Clarissa having a complete and total meltdown in the kitchen. What do you mean the card was declined? That's impossible. I have millions in that account. I followed the sound of her voice, finding her standing next to the granite kitchen island with her phone pressed to her ear and her face red with the kind of fury that usually precedes someone getting slapped with a restraining order. Yes, I'll hold. She snapped at whatever poor customer service representative had drawn the short straw. She was wearing one of her designer outfits, the kind that cost more than most people's cars, but her usual perfect composure was cracking like cheap paint. That's when she noticed me standing in the doorway, and her face went through more color changes than a mood ring in a lightning storm. Darien. Her voice was small, confused, like she was seeing a ghost. What are you doing here? I live here, I said, pulling out the keys and jingling them just to watch her face contort with confusion. Remember? This is my house. Your house? What the hell are you talking about? I inherited. You inherited jack shit, Clarissa. I walked over to the kitchen counter and leaned against it like I owned the place, which I did. Turns out your daddy left you a nice little allowance, but it came with strings attached. Strings you cut the moment you decided I was useless. Her phone was still connected to customer service, and I could hear a tinny voice asking if she was still there. She hung up with the kind of violence usually reserved for fly swatters and tennis rackets. That's impossible. I read the will. Everything was left to me. You read a forgery, sweetheart. A really expensive, really illegal forgery that's about to land you in more trouble than a turkey at Thanksgiving dinner. The color drained from her face like someone had pulled a plug. You're lying. Am I? Check your credit cards again. Try to access your bank accounts. Hell, try to turn on the lights when it gets dark. See what happens when the electric company doesn't get paid. As if on cue, her phone started ringing. The caller ID showed her personal banker's name, and she answered it with the kind of desperation you usually see in disaster movies. Richard, thank God you called. There's been some terrible mistake with my accounts. What? Frozen? What do you mean frozen? I watched her face cycle through the 5 stages of grief in fast forward. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, a kind of stunned acceptance that suggested her brain was finally catching up to reality. But I'm Richard Hayes' daughter. I inherited. What do you mean I need to speak to my lawyer? She hung up and stared at me like I'd just grown a second head. For the first time since I'd known her, Clarissa was completely, utterly speechless. Here's the thing, babe, I said, savoring every word like fine wine. Your father knew exactly what kind of person you were. He left you $10 million, more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes, but only if you could manage to treat your husband like a human being for 5 minutes. You couldn't even do that. Her phone rang again, then again, and again. Every bank, every credit card company, every financial institution she'd been bleeding dry was suddenly very interested in having a conversation about her account status. I headed toward the door, then stopped and turned back to her. She was still standing there in shock, her phone buzzing with the sound of her entire financial world imploding. Oh, and Clarissa? I said, my hand on the doorknob. You might want to call a lawyer. A good one. Because forgery and fraud are felonies. And I hear orange really isn't your color. As I walked out of what was now officially my house, I could hear her screaming my name behind me. But for the first time in weeks, the sound of Clarissa's voice didn't fill me with dread. It sounded like music. 2 days. That's how long it took for Clarissa's carefully constructed world of luxury and entitlement to come crashing down like a house of cards in a hurricane. And let me tell you, watching it happen was better than Christmas morning, the Super Bowl, and finding 20 bucks in an old jacket pocket all rolled into one beautiful karma soap package. I'd been staying at a decent hotel downtown. Nothing fancy, but a hell of an upgrade from the Sunset Motor Lodge and its symphony of human misery. Charles had advanced me some funds from the estate, enough to get a room with actual hot water and a bed that didn't feel like it was stuffed with broken dreams and regret. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using Clarissa's inheritance money to pay for my temporary accommodations. My phone had been ringing nonstop since the financial apocalypse began. Clarissa, her mother Eleanor, her worthless brother-in-law Marcus, even some of her country club friends, they were all calling with increasingly frantic messages that ranged from confused to desperate to downright threatening. I'd listened to a few of them just for the entertainment value, but mostly I just let them pile up like snow in a blizzard. The best one was from Clarissa herself, left at 2:30 in the morning on day one. Darian, there's some kind of horrible mistake. Daddy left everything to me, not you. You can't seriously believe that senile old lawyer over your own wife. Call me back immediately. We need to fix this before it gets out of hand. By day two, the tone had shifted considerably. Darian, please, you have to stop this insanity. I'm still your wife, for God's sake. Whatever Charles Whitmore told you, it's wrong. Daddy would never do this to me. He loved me. I was his little girl. That one actually made me laugh out loud. Richard's little girl, who couldn't be bothered to visit him during his final months unless she needed something. But I wasn't ready to face her yet. I needed time to process everything, to wrap my head around the fact that I'd gone from motel-dwelling reject to multimillionaire in the span of 48 hours. So I took a little vacation from reality, ordering room service and watching pay-per-view movies while Rosa Delgado and Charles Whitmore systematically dismantled every aspect of Clarissa's fraudulent little empire. Rosa called me with updates that were better than any soap opera. Your wife tried to withdraw cash from 3 different ATMs yesterday, she told me with obvious glee in her voice. When that didn't work, she went into the bank and made such a scene that they had to call security. Apparently, she demanded to speak to the president of the bank and accused them of conspiring against her. Please tell me someone got that on video. Honey, this is the digital age. Everything's on video. I've got enough footage to make a reality show called When Rich Girls Go Broke. Charles had been busy too, filing all the necessary paperwork to make the inheritance transfer official and working with the district attorney's office to build a fraud case against Clarissa that would make Al Capone's tax evasion charges look like a parking ticket. The beautiful thing about your wife, he told me during one of our daily check-ins, is that she's been so arrogant about this whole scheme that she left a paper trail a blind man could follow. She paid the forger with a check, for crying out loud. A check from Richard's account. But by the morning of day 3, I decided it was time to go home. Not to visit, not to negotiate, not to see if we could work things out like some kind of delusional marriage counselor might suggest. I was going home to claim what was rightfully mine and to look my lying, cheating, fraud-committing wife in the eye while I did it. The mansion looked different in the morning light, less intimidating, more like what it actually was, my house. I used my key to walk through the front door like I owned the place, which I did, and found Clarissa exactly where I expected her to be. In the living room, surrounded by empty wine bottles and tissues, looking like the aftermath of a very exclusive natural disaster. She'd clearly been crying for hours, maybe days. Her usually perfect hair looked like she'd been through a blender, her designer makeup was streaked down her face like war paint, and she was wearing the same clothes from 2 days ago, which for Clarissa was like showing up to church in a bikini. When she saw me, she practically launched herself off the couch with the kind of desperate energy you usually see in zombie movies. Darian, thank God you're here. I've been trying to reach you for days. There's been this terrible mistake, and we need to fix it right now before everything gets completely out of control. I stayed by the doorway, keeping a safe distance between myself and the woman who was quickly transforming from ice queen to hot mess. There's no mistake, Clarissa. Everything's working exactly the way it's supposed to. No, she said, shaking her head like she could will reality to change through sheer stubbornness. Daddy left everything to me. I'm his daughter, his blood. You were just married into the family. Just married into the family. I repeated, letting the words hang in the air like smoke from a house fire. Is that what I was to you? Just some outsider who happened to put a ring on your finger? That's not what I meant. But her eyes said otherwise. I meant that, legally speaking, blood relations usually get screwed over by their own greed. I finished for her. Your father knew exactly what kind of person you were, Clarissa. He gave you a choice. Treat your husband with basic human decency and inherit $10 million. Or be the selfish, cruel person you've always been and get nothing. You chose nothing. That's when she tried a different approach. The waterworks kicked into high gear, and suddenly she was the grieving daughter who'd just lost her father and couldn't understand how the world could be so cruel to her. I'm still your wife, she whispered, moving closer with those big, tear-filled eyes that had probably gotten her out of trouble since she was 5 years old. We took vows, Darian. For better or worse, remember? In sickness and in health. I remember, I said, pulling out my phone and opening the voice recording app. I also remember you telling me to find somewhere else to live or die because I was useless. Would you like to hear it again? I pressed play, and her own voice filled the room with all the warmth and compassion of a glacier. Find somewhere else to live or die. I don't care. You're useless now. The sound of her own cruelty playing back to her was like watching someone get slapped by their own reflection. She stood there frozen, listening to herself destroy our marriage with surgical precision. That wasn't. I was upset. I wasn't thinking clearly. You can't judge our entire marriage based on one moment. I laughed, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. Clarissa, you spent 3 weeks treating me like garbage. You told everyone I'd left town so they wouldn't contact me about legal matters. You forged legal documents and committed fraud. This wasn't one moment. This was who you really are when you thought you held all the cards. That's when I pulled out the recording device Charles had given me, the one with Richard's message. I set it on the coffee table between us like I was placing evidence at a crime scene. Your father left you something else besides that inheritance you threw away? I said, pressing play. Richard's voice filled the room, weak from illness but strong in conviction. Darian, if you're hearing this, it means my daughter has shown her true colors. I'm sorry, son. I tried to raise her better, but some people are just born selfish. You've been more of a family to me these past few years than she ever was. Clarissa collapsed back onto the couch like someone had cut her strings. The sound of her father's disappointment, his clear preference for me over her, hit her harder than any legal document ever could. He can't have meant that, she whispered. He was sick. He wasn't thinking clearly. He was thinking clearly enough to set up a will that protected me from exactly what you did to me, I said. He knew you'd show your true colors the moment you thought you had power over me. And you did exactly what he expected. For the first time in our entire marriage, I was the one in control. I was the one with the power, the money, the upper hand. And Clarissa, the woman who had called me useless and thrown me away like garbage, was the one begging. It was the sweetest feeling I'd ever experienced. Just when I thought the circus couldn't get any more entertaining, the ringmaster herself decided to make a grand entrance. Eleanor Hayes, Clarissa's mother and the undisputed queen of looking down her nose at people she considered beneath her social status, showed up at my front door like some kind of well-dressed avenging angel with a Chanel purse and enough jewelry to fund a small country's defense budget. I was in Richard's old study, my study now, going through some of his business files when I heard the commotion downstairs. Actually, commotion might be putting it mildly. It sounded more like someone was trying to stage a hostile takeover of my foyer, complete with shouting, dramatic gestures, and what I could only assume were threats involving expensive lawyers and social ruin. Where is he? Eleanor's voice carried through the mansion like she was addressing the Roman Senate. Where is that opportunistic little weasel who's trying to steal my daughter's birthright? Charming. Always nice to know what your in-laws really think of you. I made my way downstairs to find Eleanor standing in the middle of the living room like she was posing for a portrait entitled Rich Woman Having a Meltdown. She was wearing one of those outfits that screams, I have more money than God, and I want everyone to know it. A designer suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, pearls that looked like they could choke a horse, and enough diamonds to blind a small aircraft. Clarissa was hovering nearby, looking like a scolded child who'd called mommy to fix her problems. Which, let's face it, was exactly what had happened. "Ah, Eleanor," I said, walking into my own living room like I belonged there, which I did. "What a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe this visit?" She turned to face me with the kind of look that could freeze hell over, her perfectly made-up face twisted into an expression of pure disdain. "You know exactly why I'm here, you little gold-digging parasite." "Parasite?" I laughed, settling into Richard's favorite armchair, my favorite armchair now. That's rich, coming from a woman whose entire family has been living off Richard's money for the past 30 years. Her face went through more color changes than a sunset, but she managed to compose herself with the kind of self-control that only comes from decades of practice at being condescending to people she considers inferior. "Let's skip the pleasantries, shall we?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a checkbook that looked like it had seen more action than a war correspondent. "I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer to resolve this misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" I raised an eyebrow. "Is that what we're calling fraud now? How very upper class of you." She ignored my comment and started writing out a check with the kind of flourish usually reserved for signing peace treaties. $2 million, she announced, tearing off the check and holding it up like it was the Holy Grail. "More money than you've ever seen in your pathetic little life. Take it, sign whatever papers need to be signed to return my daughter's inheritance, and disappear from our lives forever." I stared at the check, then at Eleanor, then back at the check. The woman was serious. She actually thought she could buy me off like some kind of discount hitman. $2 million, I repeated slowly, like I was savoring each word. "That's your opening offer?" Her eyes lit up with the kind of predatory satisfaction that suggested she thought she'd found my price. "I knew you'd see reason. You always struck me as a practical man, despite your humble origins." "Oh, I am practical," I said, standing up and walking over to her. "Practically insulted that you think I'm stupid enough to trade a $33 million inheritance for pocket change." The confident smile slipped from her face like makeup in a rainstorm. "Excuse me. You heard me. Your daughter forged legal documents to try to steal my inheritance. Your dead husband left me everything because he knew exactly what kind of people his family really were. And now you're trying to bribe me into giving up what's legally mine. The balls on you people are absolutely astronomical." Eleanor's composure cracked like cheap paint. She grabbed the check back and started writing furiously. $5 million, she snapped, practically throwing the new check at me. "That's more than enough to set you up for life. You could buy a nice little house somewhere far away from here and live comfortably for the rest of your miserable existence." I picked up the check, looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, then tore it in half. The sound of expensive paper ripping seemed to echo through the room like a gunshot. "Lady, you could offer me $50 million and the answer would still be no. This isn't about money. This is about justice. Your daughter treated me like garbage, threw me away like I was nothing, and tried to steal from me using forged documents. Now she gets to live with the consequences." That's when Eleanor's mask finally came off completely. The polite society matron disappeared, replaced by something that looked like it belonged in a nature documentary about apex predators. "You ungrateful little worm," she hissed, her voice dropping to the kind of whisper that usually precedes someone getting shanked in a prison yard. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. Richard may have built this empire, but the Hayes family has connections you can't even imagine. We have friends in places that could make your life very, very difficult." "Is that a threat, Eleanor?" "It's a promise." She stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of expensive perfume mixed with something that smelled suspiciously like desperation. "You think you've won because you have some legal documents? Money and power are about more than paperwork, you pathetic little man. They're about influence, connections, the ability to make problems disappear." She paused for dramatic effect, clearly expecting me to start trembling with fear or begging for mercy. Instead, I just stood there looking mildly amused, which seemed to piss her off even more. "Richard built his fortune through some very questionable business practices," she continued, her smile returning with the kind of cold satisfaction that suggested she thought she'd just played her ace. "Offshore accounts, shell companies, payments to people who prefer to remain anonymous. The kind of business dealings that attract attention from federal agencies, if you know what I mean." Now she had my attention. "What are you saying?" I'm saying that if the right people started looking into Richard's financial history, they might find some very interesting irregularities. The kind of irregularities that could tie up an estate in legal proceedings for years, maybe decades. The kind that could result in asset forfeiture, criminal investigations, maybe even prison time for anyone foolish enough to benefit from ill-gotten gains. My blood ran cold. Was she talking about money laundering, tax evasion, or something even worse? Of course, Eleanor continued, clearly enjoying the look of concern that must have crossed my face. These are just rumors. Whispers. The kind of thing that would never see the light of day if reasonable people could reach a reasonable agreement. She pulled out her checkbook again, this time writing with slow, deliberate strokes. $10 million, she said, holding up the check like it was a peace treaty. Take the money, sign the papers, walk away clean. Because if you don't, I promise you'll spend the rest of your life wishing you had. I stared at the check, then at Eleanor's smug face, then at Clarissa, who was watching this whole exchange like it was a tennis match where her entire future depended on the outcome. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt a flicker of doubt. What if Eleanor was telling the truth? What if Richard's empire really was built on something illegal? What if I was about to inherit a fortune that would destroy my life instead of saving it? But as I stood there in that room, surrounded by the wealth and luxury that Richard had built through decades of hard work, I realized something important. Eleanor Hayes was desperate. Desperate people say desperate things, make desperate threats, and desperate promises. And if there's one thing I'd learned from my years of being married into this family, it's that desperate rich people are often the most dangerous kind. Eleanor, I said finally, my voice steady despite the tornado of doubts swirling in my chest. I think it's time for you to leave my house. Her face went white with rage. Your house? This will never be your house, you pathetic. Get out, I said, walking to the front door and holding it open. Now, as she stormed past me, her pearls clicking together like angry castanets, she stopped and turned back one last time. This isn't over, she whispered. Not by a long shot. And as I watched her drive away in her ridiculously expensive car, I couldn't shake the feeling that she might be right. Eleanor's threats echoed in my head like a bad song you can't shake, the kind that plays on repeat until you want to take a sledgehammer to your radio. After she'd stormed out of my house with all the dignity of a pissed-off peacock, I found myself standing in Richard's study, my study, staring at filing cabinets full of business documents that suddenly felt less like treasure chests and more like potential Pandora's boxes. Was I sitting on a fortune built from blood money? Had the man I'd respected, the father-in-law who'd treated me better than his own daughter ever had, been running some kind of criminal enterprise under the cover of legitimate business? The possibility made my stomach churn like a washing machine full of regret and bad decisions. I called Charles first, because if anyone would know about skeletons in Richard's closet, it would be his lawyer of 20 years. Eleanor came to see me today, I told him without preamble. She made some interesting allegations about Richard's business practices, something about offshore accounts and federal agencies. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that usually means someone's either dead or thinking very carefully about what they're going to say next. Darian, Charles said finally, I think we need to meet. In person. And we need to bring Rosa. That didn't sound ominous at all. 2 hours later, we were gathered in Charles's office like some kind of legal war council. Rosa had brought a laptop and enough files to stock a small library, while Charles looked like a man who was about to perform surgery on his own reputation. Before we go any further, Charles began, I need you to understand something. Everything I'm about to tell you is protected by attorney-client privilege, both with Richard and now with you as his heir. But Eleanor isn't entirely wrong. My heart sank faster than the Titanic in an ice storm. So Richard was dirty? Not dirty, Rosa interjected, pulling up what looked like bank records on her laptop. More like creatively accounting for his civic responsibilities. What the hell does that mean? Charles leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples like he was trying to massage away a decades-old headache. It means Richard was very good at finding legal ways to avoid paying taxes. Offshore shell companies, creative consulting contracts, payments to entities that existed primarily on paper. Nothing illegal, mind you, but definitely operating in the gray areas of financial law. Rosa turned her laptop around so I could see the screen. It showed a web of interconnected companies with names like Hayes International Consulting and Meridian Holdings LLC and Apex Strategic Solutions, the kind of generic business names that sound important but don't actually tell you what the hell they do. Your father-in-law was brilliant, she continued. He set up a network of companies that basically allowed him to shuffle money around like a three-card money dealer, always staying just on the right side of legal while minimizing his tax obligations to the point where the IRS probably wanted to send him a thank you card for the creative accounting lessons. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the financial spiderweb Richard had apparently spent decades weaving. So this is all legal? Technically? Yes, Charles said. Ethically questionable? Absolutely. The kind of thing that would attract unwanted attention from federal agencies if someone decided to make noise about it? You bet. That's when it hit me. Eleanor wasn't threatening to expose criminal activity. She was threatening to expose aggressive tax avoidance strategies that, while legal, would tie up Richard's estate in investigations and audits for years. She was trying to make my inheritance so toxic that I'd walk away just to avoid the hassle. So what you're telling me, I said slowly, is that Richard was basically a financial ninja who figured out how to legally screw the government out of tax money, and Eleanor's threatening to rat him out to cause me headaches? In layman's terms? Pretty much, Rosa grinned. Your father-in-law was playing 4D chess, while everyone else was playing checkers. But something still bothered me. If this is all above board, why would Eleanor think it could destroy me? Why would she be so confident that exposing it would get me to back down? Charles and Rosa exchanged a look that made my anxiety spike like a heart monitor in an emergency room. Because, Charles said carefully, there's one more thing you need to know. He pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the others and sealed with enough legal tape to suggest its contents were either extremely important or extremely dangerous. 3 months before Richard died, he came to see me, not about his will, not about his medical condition, but about this. He gestured to the sealed folder. He said he'd been contacted by someone from the Treasury Department, someone asking questions about his business practices. The room suddenly felt about 20 degrees colder. What kind of questions? The kind that suggests someone had been looking very closely at his financial activities for a very long time, Rosa said. The kind that suggests maybe Richard's creative accounting had finally attracted the wrong kind of attention. But here's the thing, Charles continued, breaking the seal on the folder with the solemnity usually reserved for reading last rites. Richard wasn't worried about the investigation. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. He pulled out a stack of documents that looked official enough to make my palms sweat. Treasury Department letterhead, FBI insignias, the kind of government paperwork that either means you're about to get a medal or about to get arrested. Darian, Charles said, looking me straight in the eye, Richard had been working with federal authorities for over 2 years. Everything you're inheriting, the money, the businesses, all of it, was part of an authorized operation to track down actual money launderers and tax evaders. I felt like someone had just told me that gravity was optional and the sky was actually purple. You're telling me Richard was an undercover agent? Not exactly, Rosa said, taking over the explanation with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she'd been dying to tell this story. More like a very well-compensated informant. The Fed suspected that some of Richard's business associates were using similar shell company setups for actual criminal purposes, drug money, human trafficking, the really nasty stuff. They needed someone on the inside who understood how these financial networks operated. She pulled up another screen on her laptop, this one showing what looked like an organizational chart that would make a conspiracy theorist weep with joy. For 2 years, Richard fed information to the Treasury Department and the FBI about suspicious financial activities in his business circles. Every questionable transaction, every shady deal, every offshore account that smelled fishy, he documented it all and handed it over to the authorities. Charles leaned forward, and for the first time since I'd known him, the old lawyer looked genuinely excited. The beautiful part is that Eleanor has no idea. She thinks she's threatening to expose Richard's crimes. But what she'd actually be exposing is a federal investigation that resulted in the arrests of 15 major financial criminals and the seizure of over $100 million in illegal assets. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process the fact that my supposedly crooked father-in-law had actually been Batman in a business suit, fighting financial crime from the inside, while maintaining the perfect cover of a slightly shady businessman. So when Eleanor threatens to expose Richard's dark secrets, I said slowly, she's actually threatening to expose herself as the daughter of a federal informant who helped take down a criminal network? Exactly, Rosa grinned. The woman is basically threatening to shoot herself in the foot with a cannon. But even as relief washed over me like a cool breeze on a hot day, another thought occurred to me. If Richard was working with the feds and Eleanor doesn't know about it, then she's about to walk into a trap of her own making. Charles finished. And we're going to let her. For the first time in days, I smiled. A real, genuine, from the bottom of my soul smile. My father-in-law hadn't just left me a fortune, he'd left me a legacy of justice. And his family was about to learn that some games are rigged from the start. You know what they say about the best-laid plans of mice and men? Well, sometimes those plans involve wearing a wire to dinner with your lying, scheming ex-wife and her equally crooked mother while federal agents listen in from a van parked outside your house. Not exactly what I'd pictured when I signed up for marriage 7 years ago, but life has a funny way of throwing you curveballs when you're expecting fastballs. After discovering that Richard had been working with the feds, Charles made a phone call that changed everything. Within 6 hours, I was sitting across from Agent Sylvia Martinez of the FBI, a woman who looked like she could bench press a Buick and had the kind of no-nonsense attitude that made you want to confess to crimes you'd never even thought about committing. "Mr. Morrison," she said, settling into the chair across from me in Charles's office. "Your father-in-law was instrumental in helping us build cases against some very dangerous people. His cooperation led to multiple arrests and the seizure of significant criminal assets." "So I've been told," I said, still trying to wrap my head around the idea that Richard had been living a double life as some kind of financial superhero. "But what does that have to do with me?" Agent Martinez smiled, and it was the kind of smile that usually preceded someone having a very bad day. "Your wife and mother-in-law are about to make a very big mistake. They're going to try to blackmail you with information about Richard's business dealings, not knowing that everything they think they know about him is exactly what we wanted his criminal associates to believe." She pulled out a small device that looked like something out of a spy movie, the kind of wire that probably cost more than my old car and was about as sophisticated as a NASA satellite. "We'd like you to wear this during your next conversation with them. Let them make their threats. Let them try to extort you. Let them dig themselves deeper into a hole they don't even know they're standing in." I stared at the device like it might bite me. "You want me to set up my own wife?" "Mr. Morrison, your wife forged legal documents, committed fraud, and is now attempting to extort money from you using false information about federal investigations. She set herself up. We're just giving her enough rope to hang herself with." Charles leaned forward, his eyes twinkling with the kind of mischief that suggested he'd been looking forward to this moment for years. "Darian, think about it. Clarissa threw you away like garbage when she thought she had all the power. Now she's about to discover what real power looks like." That evening, I was back at the mansion, wearing a wire that felt like it was burning a hole through my chest. The FBI surveillance van was parked 3 houses down, disguised as a cable repair truck. Agent Martinez and her team were listening to every word through equipment that could probably pick up a whisper from orbit. Right on schedule, Clarissa and Eleanor showed up at my front door like a pair of well-dressed vultures circling a particularly appetizing carcass. They'd clearly coordinated their outfits. Eleanor in her usual armor of pearls and entitlement, Clarissa in a black dress that was probably supposed to make her look grieving and sympathetic, but mostly just made her look like she was attending her own funeral. "Darian," Clarissa said as I let them in, "thank you for agreeing to see us. I know things have been difficult between us lately." "Difficult," I repeated, leading them into the living room. "Is that what we're calling attempted fraud now?" Eleanor shot me a look that could have frozen hell over twice. "Let's dispense with the hostile theatrics, shall we? We're here to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement." They brought a briefcase, an actual briefcase, like we were conducting some kind of arms deal in a Cold War spy novel. Eleanor set it on the coffee table with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for signing peace treaties. "Inside this case," she announced with all the drama of a game show host, "are copies of documents that prove your precious Richard was involved in some very questionable business practices. Money laundering, tax evasion, payments to entities that the IRS would find very, very interesting. She opened the briefcase to reveal stacks of papers that looked official enough to fool someone who didn't know any better. Bank statements, wire transfer records, correspondence with shell companies. It was an impressive collection of evidence that would have been devastating if it weren't exactly what the federal government had wanted Richard's associates to see. These documents, Clarissa chimed in, clearly reading from a script they'd rehearsed, could tie up Daddy's estate in federal investigations for decades. Every penny you think you've inherited could be frozen, seized, or forfeited as the proceeds of criminal activity. I played my part perfectly, letting my face show just enough concern to keep them talking. What exactly are you proposing? A simple trade, Eleanor said, pulling out a contract that looked like it had been drafted by the devil's own legal team. You sign over the estate to Clarissa, we make these documents disappear forever, and everyone walks away clean. And if I refuse? Eleanor's smile was sharper than a surgeon's scalpel. Then copies of these documents find their way to the IRS, the FBI, the Treasury Department, and every financial crimes unit on the Eastern Seaboard. Your life becomes a living hell of audits, investigations, and legal fees that would bankrupt a small country. Clarissa leaned forward with the kind of fake sympathy that made my skin crawl. We don't want to hurt you, Darien. We're trying to protect you from something that could destroy your life. Take the settlement, walk away with enough money to live comfortably, and forget this whole nightmare ever happened. How much? I asked, making my voice sound defeated. $5 million, Eleanor said promptly. More than generous for someone in your position. My position? Someone who's about to inherit a criminal empire, Clarissa said, her mask slipping just enough to show the venom underneath. Someone who's too stupid to realize that he's walking into a trap that could land him in federal prison. That was the moment I knew they'd sealed their fate. Extortion, threats, conspiracy to commit fraud. Agent Martinez was probably taking notes faster than a court stenographer on amphetamines. You know what? I said, standing up and walking to the window where I could see the fake cable truck in the distance. I think I need some time to consider your generous offer. Time. Eleanor's voice rose to the kind of pitch usually reserved for dog whistles. You don't have time. Every day you delay increases the risk that someone else discovers what we know. Maybe a week, I said, turning back to face them. Just to get my affairs in order, make sure I understand all the implications. That's when Eleanor lost it completely. The polite society matron vanished, replaced by something that belonged in a nature documentary about predatory reptiles. You listen to me, you ungrateful little parasite, she hissed, standing up so fast she knocked over her chair. We're offering you a way out of this mess, and you're going to take it. Because if you don't, I will personally make sure that your pathetic life becomes a living nightmare. I have friends in the federal government, friends who owe me favors, friends who would be very interested to know about Richard's criminal activities. Criminal activities, I repeated calmly, such as money laundering. Clarissa practically shouted. Tax evasion, conspiracy, fraud. Everything in that briefcase proves that Daddy was a criminal, and you're about to inherit the proceeds of his crimes. That's when the front door burst open like something out of an action movie. Agent Martinez and 3 other federal agents swept into the room with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested they'd done this dance before. FBI, Martinez announced, her weapon drawn but pointed at the floor. Everyone stay where you are. The look on Eleanor's face was priceless, like she'd just discovered that gravity was optional and she was about to fall upward into space. Clarissa actually screamed, a high-pitched sound that probably scared every dog in a 3-block radius. Eleanor Hayes, Martinez continued, producing handcuffs with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested she really enjoyed her job. You're under arrest for attempted extortion, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Obstruction? Eleanor sputtered as the cuffs clicked into place. What federal investigation? The one your husband was helping us conduct for the past 2 years, Martinez replied with obvious satisfaction. The one that resulted in multiple arrests and significant asset seizures. The one you just tried to blackmail his heir about. Clarissa was next, her cuffs applied while she screamed about lawyers and constitutional rights, and how this was all a terrible mistake. But as they led her toward the door, she turned back to me with a look of pure, undiluted hatred. You set us up, she spat. You betrayed your own wife. I looked her straight in the eye as Agent Martinez read her rights. Clarissa, you tried to erase me from existence. You forged legal documents, committed fraud, and then tried to extort me when that didn't work. I didn't betray you. I just let you hang yourself with your own rope. As they loaded my ex-wife and her mother into the back of federal vehicles, I couldn't help but think about that first night in the Sunset Motor Lodge when I'd thought my life was over. Turned out it was just beginning. The federal courthouse looked like something out of a legal drama. All marble columns and imposing architecture designed to make you feel simultaneously awed by the majesty of justice and terrified that you might be on the wrong side of it. I was sitting in Agent Martinez's office 3 days after the arrests, watching her flip through a file thick enough to stop a small caliber bullet while she explained exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. Your wife and mother-in-law. She began with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for people who've just solved a particularly difficult crossword puzzle, managed to confess to multiple federal crimes in under 10 minutes. It's actually impressive in its own way, like watching someone set a world record for self-destruction. The recording of that night played on her computer, and hearing Clarissa's voice admitting to forgery and extortion felt surreal, like watching a movie where the villain accidentally confesses to everything while thinking they're being clever. But here's what they didn't know, Martinez continued, pulling out another folder that looked even more official than the last one. What nobody knew, except for me, my direct supervisor, and Richard himself. She opened the folder to reveal photographs, surveillance reports, financial records, and what looked like enough documentation to write a novel about financial crime in America. At the center of it all was Richard's face, looking exactly like the man I'd known, serious, determined, and apparently living the kind of double life that would make James Bond jealous. Darian, your father-in-law wasn't just helping us catch financial criminals. He was the key to dismantling one of the largest money laundering operations on the East Coast. I stared at the photographs showing Richard at various business meetings, restaurants, and what looked like some kind of exclusive club where people wore suits that cost more than most cars. He was undercover? Not exactly undercover. More like a cooperating witness with access. See, about 3 years ago, Richard came to us. Not the other way around. He'd figured out that some of his business associates were using shell companies similar to his own for genuinely criminal purposes. She pulled out a chart that looked like something you'd see in a crime movie. Names connected by red string, photographs of stern-looking men in expensive suits, and financial flows that resembled a spider web designed by someone with a PhD in complexity theory. Marcus Valdez, Tommy the Fish Marconi, Elena Kozlova. These people weren't just avoiding taxes like Richard. They were washing money for drug cartels, human trafficking operations, and arms dealers. We're talking about billions of dollars in criminal proceeds flowing through legitimate-looking businesses. The names meant nothing to me, but the photographs did. I recognized a few faces from Richard's social events. Men who'd seemed perfectly respectable at charity galas and country club dinners. Men who'd shaken my hand and asked about my golf game while apparently running criminal enterprises on the side. Richard could have just walked away, Martinez continued. Could have kept his mouth shut and his hands clean. Instead, he came to us and said he wanted to help bring them down. She pulled out what looked like a personal letter, handwritten on Richard's familiar stationery. He wrote this after his cancer diagnosis, about 6 months before he died. It's part of the case file now, but I think you should read it. I took the letter with hands that weren't quite steady. Richard's handwriting was still strong despite his illness, and reading his words felt like having a conversation with a ghost. Agent Martinez, I know I don't have much time left, and there are things I need to make sure you understand. I didn't cooperate with your investigation because I was afraid of going to prison, or because I wanted some kind of deal for myself. I did it because I realized that my pursuit of financial advantage had put me in the same circles as genuinely evil people, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to stop them. Asterisk. I've built a fortune through legal but ethically questionable means. I won't pretend otherwise. But these people, Valdez, Marconi, the others, they profit from human suffering in ways that make my tax avoidance look like jaywalking. If my information can help put them behind bars, then maybe some good can come from the mistakes I've made. Asterisk. I'm leaving everything to Darian because he's the only person in my family who has genuine integrity. My daughter has become everything I hoped she wouldn't: entitled, cruel, and willing to hurt others for personal gain. My wife Eleanor has enabled that behavior for years. But Darian, he's a good man who deserves better than the family he married into. Asterisk. Please make sure he understands that every dollar he inherits is legitimate, not just legally, but morally. The government has verified that all assets in my estate come from lawful sources. He doesn't need to feel guilty about benefiting from my cooperation with your investigation. He's earning it by being the kind of person worthy of inheriting it. Asterisk. Use him well, Agent Martinez. He's stronger than he knows. Asterisk. I set the letter down with tears I didn't realize I'd been holding back. Richard hadn't just left me money, he'd left me vindication. Proof that someone had seen my worth when everyone else, including myself, had written me off as useless. The beautiful irony, Martinez said with a grin that suggested she'd been saving this revelation for last, is that Eleanor's threats were completely backwards. Every criminal activity she thought she could expose Richard for was actually part of an authorized federal operation. Every shell company, every questionable transaction, every offshore account, we knew about it, approved it, and used it to build our case. She pulled out a final document, this one with Department of Justice letterhead and enough official seals to stock a government supply closet. This is a letter of commendation for Richard Hayes, recognizing his contribution to Operation Clearwater, the investigation that led to 17 arrests, the seizure of $347 million in criminal assets, and the disruption of multiple international criminal enterprises. 17 arrests, including some very big fish who are now looking at decades in federal prison. Your father-in-law's information helped us map their entire operation, track their money flows, and gather evidence that will keep them behind bars for the rest of their natural lives. I thought about Clarissa and Eleanor, sitting in federal detention right now, probably still convinced they'd been the victims of some elaborate conspiracy. The irony was delicious. They tried to blackmail me with evidence of Richard's supposed crimes, not realizing they were actually threatening to expose their own ignorance about a federal investigation that had already concluded successfully. So when Eleanor said she had friends in the federal government who would be interested in Richard's activities, she was technically correct, Martinez laughed. We were very interested in his activities. Interested enough to give him a commendation and authorize payment of $2.3 million in consulting fees for his cooperation. My head snapped up. Payment. Cooperating witnesses in financial crimes cases receive compensation for their assistance, especially when that assistance leads to significant asset seizures. Richard earned every penny of that money by risking his life to help us take down some genuinely dangerous people. She pulled out bank records showing the payments, all official and documented, all completely legitimate. So when you inherited Richard's estate, you weren't just inheriting the profits from his business empire. You were inheriting payment for his service to his country. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Richard had accomplished. While his family saw him as a stern businessman who'd gotten lucky, he'd actually been a patriot who'd risked everything to help bring down criminals. There's one more thing, Martinez said, her tone shifting to something more serious. The people Richard helped us arrest, some of them have associates who are still out there. Associates who might not be happy about losing $347 million and seeing their friends go to prison. A chill ran down my spine. Are you saying I'm in danger? I'm saying you should be careful. Use security, vary your routines, be aware of your surroundings. Most of these people are smart enough to know that revenge wouldn't bring their money back, but not all criminals are smart. As I left the federal building that day, I realized that Richard hadn't just left me a fortune, he'd left me a legacy. A legacy of justice, of choosing to do the right thing even when it was dangerous, of using whatever advantages you had to make the world a better place. My wife had called me useless. My mother-in-law had called me a parasite. But Richard had called me worthy. And he'd been right all along. 6 months later, the mansion didn't feel like Richard's house anymore. It felt like home. My home. I'd redecorated the place from top to bottom, replacing Eleanor's gaudy taste with something that actually reflected who I was instead of who I was supposed to impress. The library had become my office, filled with plans for my newest project, and Richard's old study was now something I was particularly proud of. The Whitmore Foundation for Family Integrity wasn't just some tax write-off charity. It was my chance to help other people who'd been screwed over by greedy relatives and manipulative spouses. Men and women who'd been discarded like yesterday's garbage when they were no longer useful. People who needed legal help to fight back against family members who thought love was conditional on bank account balances. We'd already helped dozens of cases. Wives whose husbands had hidden assets during divorce proceedings. Adult children whose parents had been manipulated into changing their wills by gold-digging caregivers. People like me, who'd been written off as worthless until they proved otherwise. Clarissa was doing 18 months in federal prison for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. Eleanor got 2 years for the same charges plus obstruction of justice. Their letters arrived every week like clockwork, desperate pleas for forgiveness, promises that they'd changed, explanations about how prison had taught them the error of their ways. I never opened them. The woman who'd called her husband useless was probably sharing a cell with someone who'd appreciate that kind of irony. The mother-in-law who'd thought she could buy her way out of any problem had discovered that federal judges don't accept bribes or take personal checks. Sometimes I'd stand on the balcony where Richard used to watch the sunset, holding a glass of his favorite whiskey and thinking about how much had changed. The scared, broken man who'd packed his life into 2 suitcases was gone, replaced by someone who understood his own worth. Charles had been right about one thing. Sometimes the pawn really does become the king. And this king? This king wasn't interested in ruling through fear or money or manipulation. I was building something better than an empire. I was building a legacy that would have made Richard proud.